In this unit, we're going to examine the natural law. If you recall the abortion debate, when we read excerpts from Evangelium Vitae, Pope John Paul II appealed to this thing he called the natural law. He didn't explain it in any detail. That wasn't his purposes. That wasn't his purpose in Evangelium Vitae. What we're going to do now, though, is look at the natural law in detail. And the most important figure for this natural law tradition of ethics is Thomas Aquinas. And so this unit on the natural law, we're going to be looking at Aquinas's views. We're going to kind of build up into the natural law. We won't actually be talking about the natural law until we'll talk about it a little bit this week, but really next week is when we're going to get into it in detail. Before, and I should also say, so the Pope, of course, explicitly referred to the natural law, but one of the things I tried to suggest was that people like Robert George and Patrick Lee, that they are also in some way or another, although it's not explicit in their article, but in other things that they write, they are adherents of this natural law approach to ethics. Okay. Before we jump into Aquinas, though, I want to go through very quickly as possible. We'll see how quick this is. Some history, because Aristotle is writing way back, 384 to 322 BC. So that's a long time ago. And Aquinas, he'll be up here at the end, but he's over there in the 1200s. There's some 1500 years between Aristotle and Aquinas. And so one thing they might want to know is, well, what happens? Are we just jumping? Is there nothing relevant that happens there? No, there's a lot that happens there. There's a lot that's relevant. We're not going to talk about it all, but let's try to give a very quick history that's kind of tailored to our purposes for understanding what exactly this jump between Aristotle and Aquinas is, what the important developments are for understanding Aquinas vis-a-vis Aristotle, right? So we have Aristotle in 384 to 322. And for those, you may have heard of Plato and Socrates. I'm assuming you have. Doesn't really matter, though, I guess. Those philosophers were both prior to Aristotle. So Aristotle was Plato's student, and Plato was a kind of protege of Socrates. So those philosophers, those most, probably the most famous philosophers ever, I don't know, were prior to Aristotle or contemporaneous with him. After Aristotle, philosophy continues to flourish. And the period from the roughly 300 BCs to 200 ADs is referred to as Hellenistic philosophy. And it really focuses on three different schools of philosophy: Stoicism, Epicureanism, and skepticism. Or there are these three different kind of approaches to philosophy, three different systematic views, three different schools. Perhaps the best known Hellenistic philosopher is a guy who's actually kind of hard to categorize. He's either like a skeptic or a stoic, but he was also a senator in Rome named Cicero, and Cicero Avenue in Chicago. Cicero, I don't know what it is, village, town, whatever it is, neighborhood, I don't know what it is, in the area, is also named after this guy. I looked this up really quick. The road is named after the town, and the town's named after that guy. So kind of transitively, I suppose the road is named after the guy. It starts off, Hellenistic philosophy starts off in the Greek world, starts off in Athens in particular. Epicurus and the founder of Stoicism were both Athenians. Skepticism starts in Plato's Academy, which was in Athens. So it starts off as a Greek thing, right? And Aristotle was working in Athens too, right? So Athens is kind of center of philosophy, but it migrates to the Roman world, the Latin world. By the time you get into the 100s or so, you have Roman Stoic philosophers. For instance, you have someone like Cicero, even before then, right? And so Hellenistic philosophy kind of blends over into the Roman world. After Hellenistic philosophy, we get this period of philosophy called Neoplatonism. There aren't really that many famous Neoplatonists. The most famous one would be a guy named Plotinus. Not exactly a household name, but it was a very, very important school of philosophy that you can probably gather from the name. It was they saw themselves as following in Plato's footsteps in certain ways, saw Plato as kind of getting things right, and so they were just following him, a kind of rebranding of Platonism. But the Neoplatonists were also highly influenced by Aristotle. So Aristotle's writings are kind of bubbling around in the world at this time. Some of them are kind of lost, but they're making their way around, and the Neoplatonists, I believe, had access to some of them, and so they were dealing with them too. Aristotle was seen as kind of a Platonist, and kind of lumped in with Plato because Plato was his teacher. So vibrant philosophical happenings, yeah, going on for centuries after Aristotle, right? Vibrant learning, and there's all kinds of advances in any number of things. So after Aristotle, you get Euclid. He's not up there on the timeline, but kind of formalizes geometry. That's hugely important. It's where we get geometry from, right? So these really significant advances in learning. Now, another important development is the advent of Christianity. So, of course, Jesus is born. I mean, I don't know. I think people around zero. I don't think people think it was exactly at zero. I don't know what people think, what the historians think, but around zero at the very least. And he dies when he's 33. So wherever you put his date of birth, right, and that's okay. He dies 33 years later. And that, of course, spurs the development of Christianity, which in the few centuries after Jesus' death just spreads across the world, really. So Jesus's disciples go off to the east, off to the west, up north. They go everywhere, kind of down south, spreading Christianity. And of course, the Roman Empire, which was the world's leading power at the time during this era, converts to Christianity. Constantine, very famously, converts to Christianity on his deathbed. Or, well, he converts earlier, but he's baptized on his deathbed. I don't know. I can't remember exactly how it works. And so Rome becomes Christian, right? One famous thinker who's relevant here, who was influenced by Neoplatonism, but who was also a Christian, was St. Augustine. And he's considered one of the most important, if not the most important, he's in the running for most important, theologian and philosopher of Christianity. Hugely, hugely, hugely important. And one of the things St. Augustine does is he tries to take this kind of Platonic or Neoplatonic philosophy and synthesize it with Christianity, showing how these things actually are harmonious, these two different approaches, a kind of philosophical approach and a more religious theological approach are harmonious. Okay. And by the time we get to St. Augustine, we don't know exactly, but it looks like, so someone like St. Augustine didn't have access to all of Aristotle's works. In fact, he seemed to have access only to a couple. He didn't have access to the Nicomachean Ethics. It appears like he didn't, right? And so Aristotle's works are kind of gradually being lost. And by the time Rome falls, which people, if you have to put a date on it, they say 476, but I think the more careful historians will say, well, it was a kind of very gradual thing. It was happening before then, and it was happening after then, right? This gradual decline of Rome, if that's what you want to call it, although fall of Rome sounds a little bit better, I suppose. With the fall of Rome, the decline of Rome, Aristotle's works are pretty much totally lost in the West. Among European thinkers and intellectuals, European institutions, Aristotle is virtually gone. People almost totally forget about them. And that's not just true of Aristotle, that's true of a lot of philosophy. And so with the decline of Rome, this kind of vibrant philosophical, intellectual world also declines, right? And the Western world, at least, enters what people refer to as the Dark Ages, right? So, 500 and following or so. And while that's certainly a bit of an overstatement, and a lot of people are trying to push back on that label, there's some truth to it. There's not nearly as much interesting, original, groundbreaking, intellectual life after the decline of Rome as there is prior to it. And so the Western world seems this kind of vibrant intellectual world also declines along with Rome, right? And so Aristotle's works are more or less lost. Nobody really has access to them anymore, in the West at least. Going forward, another key critical event is the advent, the birth of Islam. So Muhammad is born and lives his life and does his thing slightly after this decline of Rome, off in the Middle East. And Muhammad and then his followers end up becoming much more of a political power. They take over certain lands, they set up certain institutions and so on, right? And so Islam is really growing from Muhammad on, while Europe is kind of in decline, the Middle East is growing. Yeah. And what's crucially important here is that it's not just growing kind of politically, crucially important for our purposes. It's not just growing politically or militarily, right? The Middle East, the Islamic world. It's not just growing politically or militarily. It's also growing intellectually. And so there's this period of time that people call the Islamic Golden Age. Stretches roughly from the 800s to the 1200s. The leader of the Islamic world in late 700s, I can't remember the exact date, sets up this thing I believe they call the House of Wisdom in Baghdad. It's this center of learning, this huge library, and thinkers from across the world come to this library, this center of learning. And for the next 400 years or so, there is incredible intellectual growth and development within the Islamic world. And so the way to really think about the history here is that starting with Athens and going through the kind of Roman Empire, the cutting edge of scientific learning, of philosophical investigation, of theology, really, even, right? Philosophical theology, things like that. It was really occurring in the Western world. These were the people who, this was the culture, if you will, that took up the mantle of people like Plato and Aristotle and ran with it, right? And so you have lots of important intellectual scientific developments, mathematical developments within the Western world up until around the decline of Rome. But the world doesn't go completely dark at that point. The world doesn't rise and fall with Europe or whatever, right? It doesn't go completely dark. Instead, I'm not sure the exact story, but a lot of those texts of Aristotle in particular found their way in to the Islamic world. And that's in large part what spurred the Islamic Golden Age. You had philosophers and theologians responding to, in dialogue with, Aristotle, right? And so the three of the most important philosophers, there's all kinds of thinkers during this time making all kinds of innovations in the Islamic world. But as far as philosophy is concerned, perhaps the most important probably this guy Avicenna. But also important thinkers were Al-Ghazali and Averroes. And their works are references to Plato, to Aristotle, to the Neoplatonists are all over these guys' works. They were in dialogue with them, and so they were attempting to develop a kind of Islamic theology in concert with, or that was in harmony with, or that was built off of this kind of Aristotelian Greek philosophy, right? And Averroes in particular knew Aristotle very, very well. He wrote very detailed, helpful commentaries on Aristotle's works. And the idea being, right, you've read Aristotle, it's not easy to understand what Aristotle is saying. Well, Averroes would write these commentaries to help people understand what exactly Aristotle was up to, right? So Aristotle kind of disappears from the Western world, but he's taken up in the Middle Eastern world, the Islamic world. It's not really Middle Eastern because Averroes, for instance, was off in Spain, but whatever, it doesn't matter. Islamic world's probably more accurate. And so intellectual life is the kind of intellectual frontiers are to be found in the Islamic world during this time. Right, that's where these groundbreaking kind of discoveries and investigations are happening. Just one instant, right? Algebra, that was discovered by Islamic mathematicians during the Islamic Golden Age. Algebra is an Arabic word. So very important period of intellectual history. Okay, well, so what's going on? We haven't quite gotten to Aquinas yet, so what's going on? One more key event. We have kind of Europe, right, off doing its thing, and things were, at least intellectually were going pretty well, and they really fell into pretty sharp decline. And then the Islamic world kind of took off intellectually while Europe's not doing so hot. Well, there's an intermingling between those two worlds starting around the 1100s in the form of wars, right? And there's all kinds of things to say about the Crusades. You can take classes on the Crusades, full classes on the Crusades or whatever. We're not going to get into the details. What's important for our purposes, however, is that one of the things that happens in the Crusades, so the Crusades is, it was when these kind of European powers, in particular the Catholic Church, the Pope of the Catholic Church, organized these armies to go conquer lands in the Middle East, to go reclaim the Holy Lands, right? In particular Jerusalem, but to try to take these lands back over from the Islamic rulers of those lands who had taken them over some centuries prior. Actually, well, whatever, it doesn't really matter. Well, okay, so put aside how bad or nasty those wars may have been or anything like that. That's not what we're getting to. One of the things that happens because of the Crusades is that the Crusaders coming back to Europe, they bring the spoils of war with them. And one of these spoils of war that happened to be brought back during one of these crusades are the works of Aristotle, right? So the Crusaders go off, do their thing, fight their wars, and they bring back stuff that they find. And, well, look at these books. They bring back these books by Aristotle. They bring back Averroes's commentaries on these books from Aristotle. And, what are they going to do with them? There's a bunch of knights, whatever, running around on their horses or something. So they give them to the people in the universities, right? Give them to the nerds at the university. See if they can have them. Knock yourselves out, guys. And so Aristotle is kind of reintroduced to the West with the Crusades. And it's unclear what to make of these works. So it's very clear to the people in these European universities that what Aristotle's up to is very advanced. It's very sophisticated. He's kind of miles beyond them, it seems. But it's really hard to make sense of it. And insofar as people can make sense of it, it looks like he's saying a lot of stuff that's incompatible with the Christian doctrine to which they all had subscribed. For instance, Aristotle, it's not clear if he thinks you survive bodily death. Maybe you don't. It's not clear from what Aristotle says. Aristotle argues that there was no beginning to the world, that it's conceptually impossible for the world, the universe, to have begun. Well, that's clearly incompatible with this Christian idea, Jewish idea, Islamic idea, right? And traditional religious idea that God created the world, right? So Aristotle is and so there's a lot of suspicion about Aristotle. A lot of people think this guy is antithetical to our religion, to the truths that we believe. He disagrees with them, and so we should, not read him. We should ban him. We should burn his books. We should not, whatever, something like that, right? That's the context into which Aquinas is born. Aquinas is an intellectual. He's in the university system. He's right. He's something like that. He's an educator. We'll talk about it in just a second. He's plopped into history at a time when people in the West had just kind of gotten Aristotle back and weren't sure what to make of him. And one way that people describe what Aquinas did, and this is kind of oversimple in certain ways, but whatever, maybe helps you give an idea, is he baptized Aristotle. That is to say, he helped show a harmony between Aristotle and Christian doctrine, right? So people were really worried that Aristotle was antithetical to Christianity or was in conflict with Christianity. And what Aquinas attempts to do, or did, if you think he was successful at this, is show that those tensions or conflicts between Aristotle and Christianity are superficial. And then if you dig down deeper, what you find is a kind of deep, deep harmony, that they go together, that Aristotle actually helps us understand more fully the truths of Christianity or something like that, right? That's what Aquinas thinks. And so Aquinas is very much an Aristotelian. He thinks Aristotle basically got things right, though there need to be some adjustments here and there. He didn't have the benefit of revelation. He didn't get everything exactly right. And so Aquinas is going to take up Aristotle's ideas, and what we're going to see, he's going to take up these very kind of this Aristotelian background, this fundamental Aristotelianism, and try to develop it or synthesize it with his kind of Christianity that he has inherited, right? That's what Aquinas tries to do. That's how we can understand Aquinas, right? So he's very much an Aristotelian. Now, before we jump into his philosophical work, what exactly he's up to, this stuff about the natural law and so on, a brief word about who Aquinas was, about his life. So there's a nice painting of the guy. There he is. He was born in 1225 and he dies in 1274, as we saw in the timeline. He was born in modern-day Italy. I believe at the time it was part of the Kingdom of Sicily, so down to the south. He was born in a city called Aquino. You might think, well, look, that looks like his last name. Well, yeah, it is. He doesn't really have a last name. Aquinas there just means from Aquino. So he's like Tom from Aquino, right? And Thomas Aquinas, whatever, right? That's how they would differentiate people. So it's really, his name is just Thomas, but everyone calls him Aquinas. Just means from Aquino. He joins the Dominicans in 1244, and this was a new order at that time, the Dominicans. And it was a very controversial decision, right? His parents were dead set against it. They wanted him to join the Benedictines, and they actually imprisoned him for a year when he was 19, locked him up in their castle. He comes from a kind of noble family. They had a big castle and they had a lot of money, whatever. They lock him up for a year because he's going to join the Dominicans and not the Benedictines. Can you imagine? Yeah, it's a different world, right? Your parents getting mad about which order you're going to join. But anyways, they relent eventually, and he goes and joins the Dominicans, this new order. And he studies with another saint of the Catholic Church, a guy named Albert the Great, or Albertus Magnus. And Albertus Magnus was really one of these people who was at the forefront of trying to understand Aristotle, trying to see what Aristotle says either harmonizes or is discordant with Christianity, right? That's what Albertus Magnus was really trying to do. Aquinas goes and studies with him at Paris. And then Albertus Magnus, he gets called to Cologne for some reason, and Aquinas follows him over to Cologne over in Germany there. And eventually Aquinas receives the relevant certifications, and he becomes, what we would more or less call an educator. So he goes and he teaches at the University of Paris. He's then called to teach at this university in Rome. He's then called back to Paris. He teaches there. He's then called by the Dominicans, I think, to start his own school in Naples. And so so he's being called all over the place to go teach. And during this whole time, he's writing, and he wrote a lot. We are reading excerpts from his most important and most influential work, which is called the Summa Theologica. It is huge. It is very large. It's not the only Summa he wrote. He wrote a lot. The Summa Theologica he wrote for 9 years, and it was left unfinished. He dies in 1274. He had some sort of illness, and then he was on the road traveling somewhere, and he kind of bumped his head, and it made the illness much worse, and eventually he just dies. And so the Summa Theologica is left unfinished, but he stopped writing it prior to his death, actually. The story is he had some sort of mystical vision, which made him give up on writing, something like that. You could read about the story in more detail if you like. But the Summa Theologica becomes, it's controversial in its own day and for some decades afterwards, but fairly quickly, the Catholic Church at least comes to see in it the most intellectually rigorous presentation of the Catholic faith available, right? And the Catholic Church pretty quickly after his death comes around to seeing him as a very, very important theologian. He's declared a saint in 1323, and some 200 or so years later, he's declared a doctor of the church. Doctors of the church, I believe there are 36, 7 of them. I'm not sure exactly how many there are. But the idea here is the doctors of the church are supposed to be like the best teachers of the Catholic faith, right? If you want to know what Catholicism is about, you're supposed to go read the doctors of the church. And so to be declared a doctor of the church is basically for the Catholic Church to say, yeah, what this person says, this is what we believe, something like that. So St. Augustine has also been declared a doctor of the church. Aquinas and Augustine are probably the two most important theologians of Catholicism. There was a upsurge of interest in Aquinas within the last century or so. In the late 1900s, the Pope at the time declared Aquinas's philosophy and theology to be this kind of eternal philosophy, that this is what Catholics should really study. And so all this is to say, as you might imagine, given that the Pope had more or less cited Aquinas, Aquinas is really important for the kind of Catholic intellectual tradition. In certain ways, he's at the heart of it. And so we're going to see what exactly he has to say about Aristotle in the first place, but then more particularly about this natural law and what that means and how that works.